Hello. Hi, everybody. This is Carrie Worthington. I am with NARUC'S, and we are getting you the screen. Here we go. Sorry about that technical hiccup there. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Carrie Worthington. I am with the Center for Partnerships and Innovation at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Today, the audience will be participating for the first part through the chat function. And when we get to the example, we will be opening the phones very slowly so that it reduces any background noise. But the second half of this presentation will be more interactive. So just a heads up that we will be unmuting people. So please note your own mute status and keep yourself muted if that's what you'd like to see happen. So we have a couple familiar faces on the phone, but a couple new faces also. So we wanted to take a moment to just touch base on what NARUC is. NARUC is the Association for Regulatory Utility Commissioners. We're a nonprofit. We work with all 50 states as well as FERC and the FCC. And our members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. The Center for Partnerships and Innovation is the grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members. We identify emerging challenges and connect commissions with expertise and strategies, such as this webcast. And we also build relationships, develop resources, and deliver training. We have 4 topical areas, which you can see on the right side. This webinar series is part of our emerging issues portfolio, but also valuation touches on the electricity system transition topical area. So today we're going to be discussing the Grid Valuation Framework Guidelines. It is a part of the Grid Modernization Lab Consortium project from the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm going to turn the keys over to Tom Sloan. He is a former representative with the Kansas State House of Representatives. He was one of the 25 stakeholder advisory group members, part of the Grid Valuation Framework Guidelines, which we'll explain a little bit more in a moment. If you would like to read more about Tom Sloan, we excitingly just passed an honor resolution for him at our Summer Policy Summit in Indianapolis in July. So there's about 2 pages of bio if you'd like to read all the great things that Tom Sloan has done for his the region that he represented, his state, and for the nation. So we really think Tom, he's a trendsetter and a huge collaborator, and we really thank him for his time today and for his time in the industry. Tom, do you want to introduce the panelists?
Certainly I will, but first, I really want to meet this guy that resolution talks about. He looked a lot more impressive than I realized, or else you guys make things up. But yeah, welcome to everyone who's here. The GMLC project, as Carrie said, started late in 2016 and went through March of 2019. And as she said, involved about 25 stakeholders from regulatory community, industry, state policymakers, consumer advocates, and others. Our panelists today are Chris Irwin with the U.S. Department of Energy. I imagine many of you know Chris. Larry Markle from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and Mark Ruth from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And you know, part of what we want to talk about today is that there are a number of valuation studies out there. Many of the industry consultants have developed their own and all. But what we focused on was not a formula, because technologies change, states are different, have different needs, utilities are different. We focus more on valuation study as a process with multiple stakeholders involved, recognizing that there are potentially multiple policy objectives, and that potentially there are multiple economic implications for what is chosen or the options that are out there. So the Grid Valuation Framework Guideline truly is an outline of a process, not a result. And it's a guide to aid commissioners and staff in formulating state-specific action plans that address energy producer, political, environmental, economic, and other competing interests. And so we look forward to your questions as we move through the process of describing our work and encouraging you to adopt it as it best fits your needs. With that, I welcome Chris Irwin to the conversation.
Thank you, Tom. So I just sort of wanted to set a little bit of the larger stage that actually the Department of Energy is facing as an organization that invests in research and development. But also, we think it certainly resonates with the regulatory community. And it has to do with an increase in the complexity of the system that we are involved in influencing in our own special ways. So at the Department of Energy, obviously, we invest in dozens of different technologies and R&D initiatives, and we do not have any truly uniform way of measuring those and comparing them across. In fact, it's we spend so much time describing them as different as snowflakes is that we've lost sight of the fact that they are all snow. In the regulatory positions, what we see at the Department of Energy is the fact is that the number of characteristics that you want to imbue your systems with, that you oversee, you're not taking away any of the primary characteristics that you use to measure them, safe, reliable, affordable, but you are wanting to imbue additional characteristics in this infrastructure. So you want more characteristics out, such as sustainability or resilience or security, and some of these are difficult to track. But nonetheless, is that you want to, if you had $1 to spend on infrastructure, you want to make sure that certain points are emphasized that reflect your state's values or your region's values. And then the other thing that, of course, you're faced with is that the number of possible technologies or different approaches that could satisfy your regulatory intent are diversifying underneath of us. So what we see is a multiplication of variables, both above and below the space that we're working in. And so we're trying to get to a point where valuations are not unique works of art that's the product of diligence, but nonetheless cannot be compared to each other. One of the things that I sort of seized on as we began this work was to talk about the discipline of accounting. Is that in the beginning, everybody pretty much kept their own balance sheets. You had a stock market back in the old days, but nobody measured their financial performance in the same way. After the stock market crash, it was pretty much the birth of disciplined accounting practices and generally accepted accounting practices. So I always kind of set the long-term vision for our project in the way that the accounting discipline had evolved, which is generally accepted accounting principles, which include published methodologies, transparent approaches, and accountability, certified public accountants, people who are trained to execute this kind of a standardized methodology, and all of the transparency and metrics that you need for a third-party audit of the exact same thing, so that you have all the checks and balances of a stable system. One thing that I realized when we began this investment a couple of years ago is that with the $3 million we had, we certainly would not finish. All we could do was start. So what we're presenting to you here is our approach to that. It emphasizes process, it emphasizes transparency, and it emphasizes repeatable disciplines applied to diverse situations. So that's what I'm hoping that you will get to see, and I hope that you will be cutting and critical in your questions and comments, because Larry and Mark are going to bear the brunt of that, and I will enjoy watching.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And Larry, are you starting?
Yeah, this is, Carrie gave you the sort of rules of engagement. Everyone's muted now. We're going to explain, Tom and Chris did a really good job explaining why we're doing this, but I'm going to reiterate this, try to keep it brief, set the stage for this project, and then go through the guidelines, just give you a really brief overview, and hope that you'll refer to the documents that you saw on the previous slide, which tries to give insight. And I have to say, a lot of this insight did not come from national laboratory people. They came from the industry stakeholders that we were working with, who taught us a lot about how to go through this process. We'll have questions and answers, and then we're going to have, for those who want to stay on, we're going to go through a brief exercise trying to apply the framework. And when we did this at the NARUC winter meeting in February, commissioner from Oregon said, look at what's for lunch. So that's what we're going to be doing. Okay. Next slide. So what is a valuation study? It's to compare the values, relative values of different alternatives. Can you hear me, or is there an echo? Okay.
We can hear you, but there is an echo.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's to compare different alternatives, one of which may be business as usual, or doing things as we used to do. And as Chris said, we've got a lot more choices now. We've got a lot more concern about reliability and resilience, about encouraging business and so on. So it's not just looking at economics. And people have asked, how is this different from least cost planning or integrated resource planning? Well, those are valuation studies, but those are kind of the way we've done them before. We said, let's find the lowest cost of electricity, or the lowest cost of electricity that meets environmental constraints, or a few other things, and that would be least cost planning or integrated resource planning. When it gets complex, then you start getting less of a science and more of an art. And if we go to the next slide, that's what happens then, is that everyone's got their way of doing things, and you come up with these studies that are different. And in talking to the industry partners who worked with us, they said, we read these studies and they don't give us the information we need to make a decision. And so you can't just look at environment and cost and reliability metrics, because often those metrics don't mean anything, or they don't address the heart of the problem. And there's also an over-reliance on modeling. We're doing on reliability, you hire a consultant, the consultant says, oh, I've got a reliability model, and they run the model. Is it an appropriate model? And so we're seeing a lot of if I have a hammer, everything's a nail syndrome, where you've got a model, but it's not really helpful to the process. So if you could show that, just hit the next animation. One of the things, I'm going to turn this over to Mark Ruth, but we looked at, as an example, 2 studies on the value of rooftop solar. In Maryland, they valued it at 40 cents a kilowatt hour. In Montana, it was 4 cents a kilowatt hour. why is there 10-to-1 difference? Well, the consultant, the analyst in Montana looked at a bunch of metrics and benefits of rooftop solar, and they said, those are hard to quantify. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to make them monetizable. So we're just going to ignore that. But some of the things they ignored get right to the heart of why you'd want to do rooftop solar. And NREL did a lot of work on this, so I'll turn this over to Mark for a few minutes.
Thanks, Larry. So as Chris mentioned, our overall goal at the beginning was motivated by the challenges within the accounting industry and the opportunities that they identified in terms of ways of communicating and being consistent. And as Larry just talked about, looking at the Maryland versus Montana rooftop solar study, there was some definite questions about why the 10-to-1 difference came in, what assumptions were considered negligible in one study that weren't considered negligible in another and provided value in the other, and those types of issues. However, we even identified, not just looking at these two studies, but we also did a comparison of the value of nuclear in the studies looking at the value of existing nuclear power plants and the cost of shutting them down in New York, Illinois, and Ohio. And we looked at what those studies did and tried to understand what would those investments look like and how might they play out. And we identified some of the key issues that you'll see as we get through the framework. For example, in some cases, a must-follow clear question was provided, and in other cases, it was not provided. And therefore, studies would come to somewhat different conclusions because even though they might be using the same words, they didn't necessarily have the exact same question that they were looking for. In addition, issues such as boundaries come in. What's the geographic boundary? What's the time scale? In some cases, some of these types of studies, you start seeing issues such as what's the value of rooftop solar in 40 years from now at very different grid generation mixes as opposed to next year, and what might those types of issues might come in. And then another one that we really looked at was uncertainty and implications of that uncertainty and how that really plays out. And that plays out both before choosing the model and after and working with the models. And as Larry mentioned, the challenge of this square peg group, as you see on the bottom right, is that once you have a model, you think that solves all the questions, you start building from there without thinking through some of the appropriate preliminary questions. So in many cases, much of our work was focused on how do we think through and work through these big preliminary questions that all the stakeholders are on the same page and really understand each other's differences and differences in weighting of criteria. Next slide, please. And so what we tried to do then is we tried to work through and say, well, what are the minimum requirements and or best practices through the study that allows a group to try to figure out where they need to go. And to be able to do that, we worked within kind of this structure that you can see here on slide 11 with the stakeholder advisory group that Tom was one of the key members of, and there were quite a few other members. We had NARUC involved, and then we did these tabletop and interactive exercises. The first one was the tabletop exercise, as I mentioned, was looking at existing nuclear generators, and that helped us develop the format and the structure that you'll see as Larry goes through the remainder of the presentation. And then we tested it using an interactive exercise with about 7 different stakeholder advisory group members to consider evaluation. And this one was looking at a microgrid in an unnamed town that was looking at potentially using a microgrid for expansion. What was the value of improved resilience in addition to the power production economics, and how might that play out in terms of the weighting of different monetized values for resilience with different stakeholders, and understanding how different stakeholders look at different criteria in terms of prioritizing the value of those. Then ultimately we had the draft guidelines. We worked with external reviewers, and we used an interactive section at NARUC last February, which is going to be very similar to some of the things that you try out, although in a little bit more depth later on in this call, just to try to understand and test this framework to see if it starts to get to a point, not only in terms of a framework, in terms of a way to do the analysis, but also a way to communicate, hey, we considered these items, we were explicitly chose which ones to include and which ones not to include, because we found that what was implicit or not absolutely stated were some of the key issues that would cause differences between studies as we looked at them. With that, I'll turn it back to Larry to talk more about kind of our process and what we ended up with, including the scenarios that were studied at the NARUC'S session last February.
Mm-hmm. We go to the next slide. The objective overall was, as you say, to allow stakeholders to and public utility commissions, regulators to conduct studies to weigh alternatives and do this consistently and be able to compare them. What you're going to see is not a new method of doing evaluation. Pretty much, if someone says, figure out what this is worth, the value of it, or compare these alternatives, you're going to take very similar approaches. But we're focusing on quality assurance of the process and making sure that things are consistent. It starts with being very precise in stating why you're doing the study and what issue you're addressing. And then what was really hammered home was what is going to influence your decision. So you can't just say reliability. Why do you want reliability? What's that going to happen? What we heard from a lot of the regulators was, this is about economics, this is about public health and safety, this is about growth. And so you quickly got away from the traditional metrics of what's the cost of electricity, and you started looking at non-traditional ways to meet those objectives. So instead of just saying, well, what's the next generator, you might say, do we want to do conservation? Do we want to do a microgrid? Do we want to do distributed energy? And that leads into what's the information you need and how do you measure it, which are the metrics. And that's where there's been a big stumbling block in some of these, where say, oh, reliability, I've got 7 different reliability metrics. NERC refers to them, we'll just show you the impacts. Well, telling somebody I've got a loss of load probability of 0.1 versus 0.08, what does that mean? Is it usable? And that was really what we kept facing, was that the studies we thought, national lab people thought, well, we're going to have to figure out the best models, and it wasn't the best models. It was all about how do we do the process and make sure that the study method is working. And then we turned to Chris Irwin and we said, this is turning out differently. We're really looking at the process. Does this make sense? So we looked at a couple other disciplines, as you can see in the box there. Your pilot, when you take a flight, he or she has a checklist and they go through dozens of things. Why? Because there's so many things you forget things. You've done it so often you can do it in your sleep, and you tend to do it in your sleep, and you forget something or you make an implicit assumption. A medical checklist, looking at a standard procedure, putting in a central line where you had different things about checking things, certifying stuff, washing your hands between each step, making sure that doctors and nurses followed that procedure. It reduced secondary infection rates from the central line by 95%. So there really is some value in making sure that the process is adhered to and that the everything is consistent. So if we go to the next slide, I'll get to the framework, which is, it has 4 phases. I'm going to try to give you an overview just so you know what they are. I'm not going to explain the insights or the process in great detail. I hope we'll get to some of that in the exercise, but I encourage you to try to read the documents. There is a summary which is presents the framework, and it's a short report. Then there's the full report with a lot of appendices, and then there's another one that talks about other disciplines that looked at standards to address a process instead of quality assurance for a process. Next slide. So this is where the evaluation process usually falters, is to sit there and say, what are you really trying to do? And when people say, I want, electricity that's affordable, environmentally benign, and reliable, yeah, but it's got to be more than that. Why are you doing that? Is it because of economic growth? Is it, you've got to say what the purpose is and really try to quantify that as much as possible. We'll describe that in more detail during the exercise, but again, this seems basic and simple, but it's usually glossed over, and they're just saying, oh yeah, we're doing the next plan, and then we're looking at alternatives. And here you've got to say, well, are there alternatives that we're skipping? And by looking at what you're really trying to accomplish in the study, or what your goal is, what you would like tomorrow to look like, that is, that's where you find, well, maybe there's another way to do this besides the ones we've always looked at. And the stakeholder engagement is something that we kept coming back to over and over again, is who are the stakeholders, the vocal ones and the non-vocal ones? Who do you have to talk to? And many cases you have to use the stakeholders to further define what the objective of the study is, or to identify the alternatives. The Eastern Interconnection Planning Collaboration, looking at how to multi-state in the East, how to build out the system, formed a stakeholder committee to sit there and say, what things should we be looking at? And the EPIC, EPIC thing could have been very contentious, but by getting some of the major groups involved at the start, it became much more, a much smoother process, and the results were much more acceptable because people were involved in saying, hey, don't forget looking at this. And too often in these studies, people will say, you never looked at biomass, or you never looked at energy efficiency. There is no magic way to do stakeholders. Some stakeholders have their own things. Nuclear energy is bad, we're never going to approve it. So you've got to figure out how to engage that group of stakeholders, because they're not going to be constructive, but you still have to consider them. So we got a lot of guidance from the stakeholder advisory group. Again, there's no magic bullet, but getting people involved and making decisions very deliberately, and documenting those decisions, saying this is why we looked at those, does help with the acceptability of the results. And I didn't put a little circular arrow here, but you don't do step 1, 2, and 3. You may do 1, then 2, then go back to 1, and say, we're looking at different alternatives. When you get the stakeholders involved, you often re-examine what are the objectives and what are the alternatives. The next slide, please. And this, again, is very hard to explain in abstract, but a lot of times people take these buzzwords and they say, well, we want resilience. Well, how do I determine resilience, and what does the resilience mean? Do I recover quickly from a hurricane? Do I recover from a lightning storm? What are the metrics? How do I measure that? What are the pieces of information I need? And so we have a very deliberate task to identify all the information you'd like and sort of prioritize that and say what's most important. And then how do I weigh the fact that it's not even apples and oranges, it's apples and suitcases. You can't often do a trade-off between environmental quality and resilience and cost and engendering growth and creating jobs. It's very difficult. So if you hit the button again to do the little slide. So you really choose the metrics to say how I'm going to differentiate alternatives and choose them. And a lot of times these metrics can't be quantified. You'd like to express them in a common denominator like dollars. That's often not possible. But if you can agree on how you're going to address these, and there isn't a nice graphic to put up or something, or say, here's the optimal choice, but even just putting all the different alternatives up and how they are expressed through the different metrics gets people to debate that. And so they can start debating on the value of comparative values of different metrics instead of arguing about whether you did the study correctly. Next slide. Mark mentioned uncertainty, and there's a lot of uncertainty. If you're looking at reliability, what are you planning against? You know, a lot of times the way to quantify that is to be very clear about what am I not sure about, and that can be price, it can be growth, it can be the environmental consequences, the threats I'm guarding against, and it can be the performance of a technology I'm trying. And you've got to really look at that and say, if you can hit the next button. We try to do this as a risk and say, if there's an uncertainty, what does it mean? How sure am I of something? What happens if I'm wrong? How can I hedge my bets against that? And that becomes really important because risk is asymmetric. So if I take a look at weather and say, well, I've got different probabilities of having a magnitude 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hurricane, and I come up with the expected value, and I say, okay, I'm going to build against a hurricane of magnitude 2.7. That's not going to help if there's a real possibility you're going to get a magnitude 4 hurricane, and you really want to build against that. So again, the uncertainty becomes very important, and it's only then that you start looking at the methods, the tools and methods, and what we heard from the stakeholders a lot were the regulators don't keep focusing on models. There's methods, there's tools, and they're not all related to the grid. If we want to engender economic development, which often is what we're trying to do, we don't need a lot of precision in how we're modeling the grid. We may be looking at spending our time and our budget looking at the economic effects and trying to get a handle on that. So when you select tools, the methods, the models, you've got to look at your schedule, you've got to look at your budget, and you've got to look at what's going to give you the best information for those key metrics back there in steps 4 and 5. And then you go to the next step, which is assumptions and data. Okay, no, go back one slide there. In the assumptions thing, the problem is that you've got, the problem is that you may come up with a method, a tool, a model or something, and then you say, but I don't have the information to use that. So you may have to go back and iterate a couple steps and say, well, that's an uncertainty, or, I'd like to know this, but I don't. So again, the guidelines, the framework report tries to give you some guidance and walk you through step by step. Next one. So really the easy one, the most straightforward, is to run the methodology, make sure your data assumptions are documented and they're consistent, and present the values for each metric or impact from each analysis and compare that. And then you can have a discussion that way. A lot of times how you present the results and how you got to this step determines whether you're going to have a constructive debate about which alternative to choose and whether the decision is going to be acceptable to the community, whether it's you as a decision maker or other stakeholders. If you go to hit the button on that one too. So if we go to the next slide, that's the framework. There should be an arrow, and I forgot to put it in along the side that says stakeholder engagement, because at every point you've got to figure out how you're reporting your results, how you're coming up with decisions, what model, what approach we're going to use, how we're going to rank things. And you're not going to always get agreement, but it's when people take a look at a study such as those two solar studies that Mark would talked about at the front part and say, why are they different? And you have to dig into the thing and say, try to find out how they came up with different answers. So not everyone's going to agree with the answer, but you can't have a black box represent your analysis, or people will just mistrust it. So transparency is really important, and getting people involved, and that's a delicate line, because some of the groups that you want involved are not going to be involved constructively. They have their agendas, they know what they want done, and others really are trying to come up with the best thing. So again, there's no magic way to do this, but it's got to be done deliberately and step by step, and this is a way to have acceptance of your study and be able to compare studies. Next slide. In the full report, the last appendix has a workbook that lists, in the report we describe the different steps and the phases and what you should do and what comes out of them. And then we try to give some examples. We try to give, up in the different appendices, different things that you can use to address this. The workbook actually came out from getting ready for that NARUC'S session in February, where we had people look at some scenarios, and we said, okay, what questions should we look at, and let's write things down and let's compare our notes. And so the workbook was an extension of that to, again, try to give a template or something to provide guidance. This is not supposed to be, you do this and you'll have a study, but this was to help people think and come up with new ideas, new alternatives. If we go to the next slide, that's really the overview of the structure and some of the big points I wanted to make on this. And I guess Mark, is there anything you'd like to say that I might have missed or didn't emphasize properly or did wrong?
No, Larry, thanks for a great overview and a great summary of what we covered. I think just the only thing I would add is that this was, in many ways, just step one along the way, as Chris talked about at the beginning. We believe we now have a workable structure and a workable system that we can start to follow. However, in many ways, there's still a lot of details that we're working out, we're trying to understand, we're trying to improve. And we believe the best way to kind of move forward at this point is to start testing it in different cases, both to improve those analyses or those evaluation studies, and to get an overall estimate or overall viewpoint of what the challenges and what the changes to this structure need to be.
And this is Tom, and to sort of pick up on Mark's comments, I think one of the most important things that Larry said was that not every stakeholder group will buy into the process or into the collaboration, but that it's vital that everyone be heard. And those of you with commissions understand that in a hearing, if someone can stand up and say, but no one listened to us, i.e. no one would give us access to the process, that is significantly different than someone standing up and saying, we don't like it because you didn't incorporate all of our values. And so what we're trying to do in this valuation study is develop that process where you're looking at the variables that are important to you. Again, as Larry said, that could be economic development, it could be security, it could be, or Chris pointed that out too, but that the relevant stakeholders all have a chance to participate. And so with that, I'll return it to Larry.
Chris, do you want to add anything?
No, I am perfectly good. I'm happy with the existing comments.
Okay. So we're going to try an experiment now, and we haven't done this with the webinar certainly with this many people. We're going to go through an exercise, and we were trying to come up with a simple real-world exercise, and Carrie reminded me that a commissioner from Oregon said, apply this to choosing where to go for lunch. And I think that's going to identify the process and how we think. So we're going to go through that. Please keep yourself muted at your own phone, but then raise your hand or call out as we go through this. So the thing is, hey, I'm hungry. I forgot to bring my lunch at work today. I could go get a sandwich. And there, it's sort of like a least cost planning thing. You know, I could get a sandwich, go get something that's a decent place, get it quickly, get it cheap, bring it back here or eat it there. But maybe it'd be nice to have some people go with me. So what do I do next? Okay, next slide. So now we're trying to define the scope and the goal. And anybody want to talk about, look at this? Feel free to shout out.
Sorry, the question?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question or the instructions, please?
Okay. So, so I'd like people to suggest how they would define the purpose of this thing. I'm hungry, but are there other aspects in this?
Making the most enjoyable lunch.
If people want to shout, if not, we've got, you know, we could just sort of walk through some suggestions.
Sustenance.
Okay, sustenance. Okay, Carrie, why don't you click on the purposes? And so, yeah, we want to get some food. It'd be nice to get out of the office. I've got a couple of close friends. On the other hand, we've got a big group and we've got some new people who just started. So maybe we should actually have a real lunch. Well, now we've got sort of scope creep, but we're starting to look at ways to use lunch to accomplish other things which go beyond where can I get a decent sandwich quickly and cheaply. So I think what I'll do is go through this, but let people, if anyone wants to make a comment, just jump in. So
they might be able to, they might have some grounds for marketing. But unless it's needed for reliability. And there might be cases in which it would be needed for reliability.
So I have a question.
yes.
So you're looking for scope right now? You're looking for input?
Yeah, which gets into how big a decision am I going to make, or how involved a decision what am I going to look at? Okay, why don't we click on that, and again, we're trying this, so I can go out by myself, I can get my friends to go, I can ask for the larger people to go, but am I trying to be efficient in lunch, or is this going to be an event? And I've got to worry about how much time this is going to take. This isn't meant to be the answer or definitive. This is just some of the things that you're considering when you're coming up with the thing of, I want to start looking at weighing alternatives for having lunch.
But when you talk about the scope is what you're trying to achieve. And
right.
When you look at time considerations or possibly transportation issues with the group size, isn't that environment and constraints and parameters that would lead you down to what alternatives or what is actually, you almost start ranking what's feasible and what's not feasible? Yeah. So isn't it something between scope and alternatives?
Yeah, saying scope may be bad. What I meant by this was, what are the things that I'm going to be considering when I choose alternatives and characterize alternatives?
All right, so it's considerations.
Yeah, considerations would be a better.
Environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, considerations, environments, constraints. Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay. Again, please excuse us. We're just trying this thing. It was on the phone. It's not that easy. So going to alternatives, there's the typical alternatives. Why don't you click on that? And there's nothing really new here, but then if you go to stakeholders and you say, who are the stakeholders? Well, there's me, I brought it up. But then there's the people I work with every day, a few of them. And then there's possibly our whole group in the office. If you click on that first box, our boss may be a stakeholder if she doesn't want us to be away from work for 2 hours. But now we say, okay, how are we going to engage this? So click on that. And I can ask people, but if it's a large group, maybe I do a poll. Or I can just say, hey, we're going out to this place. Do you want to come? So the question is, do I give them a choice of coming or going? Do I give them, we may go here, we may go there? Do I open it up? And that engagement becomes very different if I want to have a large group or a small group, if I'm mainly looking at lunch, or if I'm mainly looking at this as a social interaction. Okay, so next is decision process. And again, this becomes very tailored to what I think the main purpose was. Is to get lunch quickly, efficiently, and being pleasant? Or is it to do something more and look at increasing the coherency of the group, or introducing new people to the group, or just having conversations? So that gets into, do I look for a consensus? Do I have everyone vote? Someone says, I really hate that place, or I really love that place. Do I give them more weight than other people saying, yeah, this is good or this is bad? And then, of course, you've got hard constraints such as I can't eat gluten or something. And based on that, I may have to go back and look at what alternatives, which restaurants I've been considering, and I may have to get some other ones in the list. Okay. Anybody want to comment? No.
Yeah, this is Ron Lair. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I raised a couple times in the stakeholder process in this grid valuation study the notion of really identifying carefully who's making the decision and how they do that, and tried to make the distinction between public decision makers like the great American Tom Sloan in a legislative context, or a commissioner.
Thank you, Ron.
With due process or administrative due process requirement, expert testimony on the record, so on, versus a private sector decision maker who's typically looking at a budget or an investment and has to go through something called due diligence, financial due diligence. These things are very similar. They're processes of questioning until you're satisfied that the vote you've got as a decision maker, that you can vote your vote with confidence. You've answered all the questions have been asked and answered, and you're ready to vote yes or no on the proposition. So I'm hoping that in the write-up of this, that there's more attention to focus on the decision maker and how they do their work. And it leads me to suggest that it's really important for the rest of us who get to try to influence decisions in one way or another, but rarely get to make them. It's really important to try to prepare that decision maker with the right kinds of questions to ask. It's really, decision making, my experience, is really about asking the right kind of questions. So I would just throw that in as an observation.
I thank you for that. I think that's really important, and I'm not sure we are as explicit in the framework as we should be. We did try to address that, and that's some of this is sitting there saying, we're going out, you want to join, where I'm the decision maker, or me and one or two friends are the decision makers, versus is this a process where the group should be a decision maker? And that gets to be really important, and how you ask the questions and what kind of questions you ask really lays the groundwork, as we'll go in this example, as to whether the ultimate outcome is acceptable or not, whether lunch is a success or not.
So does it come down to, and again, I think part of this is missing a feedback loop, because you need to compare it. You need to compare it to what your actual purpose or scope was, because once you have the decision-making process, depending on what path you go down, you really need to know exactly how to measure against what actually the scope was or the purpose was, because once you go down the road of alternatives and stakeholders, sometimes you end up going down a path that leads you further away from what the scope actually is.
Yeah, and in the write-up, we tried to say you have to keep going back to your context, your purpose, your scope, and saying, am I straying from that? So I think that's part of what we're trying to convey in this process, not getting into as much feedback in this little example, but you're absolutely right, because that's where these valuation studies often go astray, or start getting involved in minutia or alternatives that don't really help with the decision.
But Larry, the point that you're making, I think, in this is that you are including the stakeholders in the decision-making discussion. And you've defined what the decision-making group is. I mean, whether it's just a small group of people you want to have a quick lunch, or whether you want a large group, but then you are, in effect, saying, all right, now this is a consensus or a majority, but it's a group decision process, and it's the process that you're talking about.
Yes, although one of the options would be for us to say in the engagement, we're doing this, you want to go. So in effect, the private person made a decision, and they're opening up options for stakeholders to participate, but it's not opening up the decision for everyone except whether they want to be part of this or not. So,
but that's a process.
It's a process, yeah.
So this is Mark. One of the other things that we tried to do is we tried to understand that for a single issue, different people would make decisions in different ways with different criteria. And we didn't so much focus on exactly who gets the final say or what the final decision is, but more in making explicit exactly what those criteria are and what those issues are across the different stakeholder groups. That way we allowed for the flexibility of more of a group decision-making process where there is either reaching a consensus or something else around the right set of criteria, the right way to weight them, and then ultimately the right decision, or maybe just the right decision after going through the other two processes. Or if it's a single decision maker, say a single company making an investment, it's understanding what some of the challenges and opportunities there might be. And so there is some discussion in the document about that. However, I think that it's more focused on the process and how decisions would be made differently by different groups, or the decisions would reach different conclusions if made by different groups due to their different sets of criteria, and making that explicit to understand each other. So that's kind of the piece that I think that we really focused on, as opposed to identifying a specific decision maker and which specific pieces of information they're looking for. It was more of it's more of a structural piece of work that we did.
And I think one of the things when we started this, some of the stakeholder and reviewers said, who's your audience? And we had thought there was a big audience. At one point we thought, well, it's the analysts coming up with helping them. And we heard, no, the analysts know what to do. They just don't always give us what we, the regulators, want. And then we talked a lot about the utilities or the investors, and they have to make a fiduciary decision. They have to jump through some hoops. They must meet some criteria. And we found that a lot of this was much more of interest to the regulators, who said, it's not clear who's making the decision. The commission may be making a decision, but it's a cooperative decision, or the stakeholder input is really important, and it's not just a matter of fiduciary responsibility. So this, we felt, was more useful to a regulator than, say, a utility.
Hey Larry, this is Carrie. Maybe we should move on to the next phase.
Yeah, right. I think that will add some more, that will illuminate better. Why don't we just click on the boxes, because the metrics, cost, speed, can we get everyone at a table to, and what the food quality is important. But then if you start looking at the non-quantifiable metrics, is this a social event? Is this team building? You talk about the ambience, and also if the process of deciding this with a large group makes everyone frustrated because you're spending an hour deciding where to go to lunch, that's a real problem, and it starts looking at what your time budget and effort budget is. And getting into the multi-objective thing, you've got to think about how to weigh all these things together, and there's no clear trade-off or optimization thing. And for the stakeholders, people who are really disappointed with where you go, that just kills the bonding opportunity objective. And you also have to think about the stakeholder who may say something, but then in the end will not go, or no matter what you do, it always complains. Or someone who says, well, this restaurant is great, but the waiters are striking and I have a problem with that. So the multi-objective decision process, it needs to be addressed, and there's no formula for doing it, but it needs to be recognized, and you have to be very deliberate on how we're going to make the decision, or what we considered in making the decision. Okay. Why don't we go to the next one? So why don't we click on all the things so people are welcome to chime in. We talked about the different uncertainties, and that includes how many people are actually going to come, because if we pick the big restaurant and there's only 3 people there, or we picked a small thing and there's too many, We got to look at what if we guessed wrong, what are the consequences, and then getting back to the process of how we're making the choice. There's some constraints. We need to decide before it's noontime. Do we do a vote? Do we sense consensus, like a voice vote? Do we offer limited choices? Do we Google the restaurant ratings and say, here are the best things? Do we look for people saying, oh, I really enjoyed going to that restaurant, or I really hated it? And that gets into the real thing of, we've looked at alternatives, we've looked at uncertainties, now we got to apply the tool, and the tool is basically, how do we choose among these alternatives? And if we click on number 8, again, there's feedback. Which restaurants did we consider? Do we have information to look at those? Should we be looking at other ones? We talked about the metrics, but there's a lot of unknowns still. So in making this, how many people did we think would come? Is that what's likely to happen? Do we need to look at more alternatives? So again, in the report, we tried to talk about this and offer guidance and offer examples. As Mark said, we felt the next step was to actually use these principles or this philosophy to work with state utility commissions or help them apply them to real decisions. And in doing that, we're hoping that we can come up with some more concrete examples or trade-offs, like some of the comments we've already heard, that we can put in the document to make it more useful or give more guidance and insight. And then at the end, phase D, we've decided, we said we're going here. How do you present that decision? Well, we decided to go. Wait, I said I didn't want to go there, or wait, I said I wanted this. So do you talk about the options you considered? Do you document what trade-offs you made? If somebody objects or just asks this, does that change how you present the decision? And again, that gets back into the previous steps where you have to be deliberate on what you've done. You have to document it, and you have to be able to say, well, this is why we didn't go there, because Joe can't eat gluten, and this is a place that's known for its bread. So you're not going to make everyone happy, but you do have to address. You have to document as you go along, and that's in the guidelines. You have to go along with choices you make, how you considered them. So people ask you, well, how did you arrive here? You've got to be able to talk about that, because the acceptance of your decision is going to depend on your ability to not just defend it, but explain how you arrived at it. Well, I guess, again, with 50 to 80 people on a call, I think it's tough to do an interactive exercise, but that was trying to give you an idea of how we viewed these steps and phases and the feedback and the approach. I'm hoping you'll read the document, and feel free to give us, and Carrie will be able to be a point of contact, feedback on what would make this more useful or points that we should be covering. Tom, any, or Mark, anything you'd like to say? Okay.
Yeah. Mark, do you have something?
No, I don't have anything else to add.
Chris, do you?
Chris is offline, but I just wanted to encourage folks to send any questions they have to the chat box, or if you'd like to be unmuted, to raise your hand through the GoToWebinar software so that we can address any questions. Tom, I have a few announcements, but if you want to say any final thoughts before we see if there's any other questions.
before we get to that, again, I wanted to reiterate, I opened with, unlike a lot of consultants' reports that give you specific numbers or formulas or whatever, the process here is what we're saying, is to include as many stakeholders, at least the relevant ones, as possible. The consensus will not necessarily be achieved, but that everyone will have had a chance to have their position, their ideas, their concepts, considered. And that, again, looking at it from a commission standpoint, whether it's the commission staff that convenes something like this, or the commissioners do it, or they, ask the legislators to do it, or anoint a group of independent, utility execs or third parties, whatever, it doesn't matter. What matters is that this provides you an opportunity to look at how many different stakeholders, how many different interests, and is there a way to maximize the achievement of your overall objectives, which you started with by putting them down. And with that, Carrie, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Larry and Mark and Chris. I'm not seeing any questions come in, so I wanted to let you know that you can email me at any time about this project or any of our other projects, but we will be posting the recording, the slides, and the documents on our website before the end of the day tomorrow. If you would like to join us in the future, I'm showing a slide of the upcoming webinars. We have these webinars monthly, and we have a schedule through the end of the calendar year that includes nature versus infrastructure, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and research and development. And our partner group, the National Regulatory Research Institute, is hosting a webinar next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on delinquencies and disconnections. It's part of a series that they're working with the Committee on Consumers in the Public Interest on, and it should be very exciting for our members and other state agencies. At this time, I wanted to thank you all for your time today. We're concluding at 4:10 p.m. Eastern, and we hope to see you at future events. Again, email me anytime, and we'll get the materials posted. I hope everyone has a good rest of the evening. Bye now.